Rowan Atkinson, who is widely known for his comedic roles and his love of cars, has delivered a powerful speech at the parliamentary reception for the Reform Section 5 campaign advocating for the protection of civil liberties. In his speech, he highlights the importance of free speech and criticises Section 5 of the Public Order Act 1986. Now, the point about this act, it's a piece of UK legislation that deals with disorderly conduct, and it makes it an offence to, quote, use threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviour, or disorderly behaviour within the hearing or sight of a person likely to be caused in harassment, alarm, or distress thereby. Specifically, the text states a person is guilty of an offence if he, note the sexist language, A, uses threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviour, or disorderly behaviour, or B, displays any writing, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive, or insulting within the hearing or sight of a person likely to be caused harassment, alarm, or distress thereby. The problem is the terms are vague and the law is frankly absurd. Threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviour, these terms are so broad and can be interpreted in various ways depending on the context. When a person what one person considers insulting or abusive might not be the same to another, and this ambiguity can lead to inconsistent enforcement and potentially unjust prosecutions, likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress. Well, the phrase again shifts the focus from the actual impact of the words or behaviour to the potential for causing distress, to the possibility of distress. This introduces a level of subjectivity on the part of an observer, not even the person who is being distressed or potentially distressed. It's based on what an average person might consider distressing rather than the actual effect of a specific on a specific individual. Within the hearing or sight of a person, this suggests that the offence is not dependent on whether anyone actually experienced harassment, alarm, or distress, but rather on the potential for someone to have done so. This is about potential crime rather than actual crime, and this aspect has been criticised for criminalising speech or behaviour that's not directed at anyone in particular and hasn't actually caused offence. The primary concern with Section 5 is its overly broad and vague language, because terms like insulting or likely to cause distress are so subjective, the law can be interpreted and applied in such a wide range of scenarios, some of which involve relatively harmless or trivial incidents. And critics argue that the wording of Section 5 unduly restricts free speech, which is a fundamental part of our society. The law could potentially criminalise the expression of opinions that are simply provocative or unpopular. But we need to hear opinions which are provocative and unpopular, otherwise we cannot defend ourselves, we cannot react, we cannot develop, we cannot grow. And the misuse of this law, the vagueness of this law, opens up opportunities for overzealous enforcement or targeted misuse, where individuals might be prosecuted for actions or words that do not actually warrant legal intervention. There have been cases where people have been arrested for such trivial matters, and Rowan Atkinson brings up some of these issues very clearly. It's a nonsensical law, and we don't need nonsensical laws in this country. We don't need nonsensical laws anywhere, frankly. Atkinson's speech itself is a passionate defence of free speech, emphasising the fundamental importance of open discussion in a democratic society, and he argues that free expression is second only to the basic necessities of life like food and shelter. He expresses concern not for himself, given his public profile, but for ordinary people who face the risk of being criminalised for minor or perceived offences, as seen in the cases that he cites, like the police horse being called gay, or the teenager for calling the Church of Scientology a cult. Or what is it? It surely is a cult, and I think all the consonants are correct in that word. Atkinson criticises the new intolerance where well-intentioned laws aimed at curbing hate speech have inadvertently fostered an authoritarian cult that suppresses free expression. And he argues that insulting language should not be criminalised because the interpretation of what constitutes an insult is subjective and easily abused. And the difference, particularly for someone like Rowan Atkinson, between maliciously insulting language and satire is huge. He believes that society should build resilience against offensive speech by allowing more of it, as exposure strengthens tolerance. The speech also critiques the media and the police's role in escalating minor incidents into legal matters driven by outrage that stokes this outrage industry, which stokes public indignation. He calls for the repeal of Section 5 of the Public Order Act, which allows for the arrest of individuals based on this subjective, whimsical, flippy-floppy, vague concept of an insult, advocating instead for robust dialogue and the right to offend as essential components of free speech. His account is compelling. It's a compelling argument for the preservation of freedom and the development of civil responsibility, particularly in the face of restrictions and in the sight of growing tyranny in our neighbourhood, growing tyranny in Russia, in China, in Hungary. Hungary, so much tyranny, the roads aren't well kept. Hungary, so much tyranny, you actually have guards monitoring your exit from the country. The road narrows and you can hardly get out. Queues of traffic to get into and get out of Hungary. And Hungary is in the EU, in contrast to Serbia, where the roads are lovely, passive and straight. And Serbia is not in the EU. I cannot imagine why I would be defending Serbia, except in a motorway context. But Rowan Atkinson's critique, it may be idealistic. He may be trying to simplify a complex landscape of modern social media where speech can have far-reaching and immediate consequences, but the notion that a society should build immunity to offensive speech is important. And I don't think it overlooks the real harm that certain speech, particularly racism, for example, can inflict, especially on marginalised groups. While Atkinson rightly points out the dangers of over-criminalisation and the chilling effect it can have, maybe he underestimates the challenge of balancing free speech with the need to protect individuals from targeted harassment and hate speech. But I think that can be built into a form of repeal. This is a law that is too vague to remain on the statute book. His argument against the new intolerance is part of I think, a general development of inclusivity and respectful public discourse. And I think where laws overreach, they need to be pulled back. It should be understood, his speech should be understood within the broader context of debates on free speech in the UK and globally. His reference to Section 5 of the Public Order Act touches on ongoing concerns about the balance between free speech and public order, which has been ongoing not only in our country but in others. And it's vital that this conversation is had because of the urgency of the social media legislation, which is already going through Parliament, which is already poised to enter real law, and it's also badly drafted. Badly drafted partly because it was begun by somebody who didn't have management of her ministry, and continued by another two people who didn't have management of their ministry. I refer to Nadine Dorries, Michelle Donnellan, and Lucy Fraser. Three people who should never have been given that control. Three people who managed to plough through a very important piece of legislation, but which undoubtedly is full of failure, in the same way that this particular act from the 1980s is full of failure. Section 5 of the Public Order Act needs to be repealed, and I would say that the Online Safety Act needs to be reviewed on the same principles. Atkinson's defence of free speech is passionate and well argued. It raises important questions that need to be considered now before we do more damage. The location for good free speech is in education and in self-empowerment. The law should only get involved when we go beyond the realms of civilized, responsible conduct. Defining that is hard, I understand, but over-defining it is dangerous.